Did you know that you can make your own turkey stock at home right in your own kitchen? And did you know that it only takes the bones from one carcass of a turkey that you made on Thanksgiving or maybe for Christmas? Stock and turkey stock is made from simmering bones that have a little bit of meat on them. And it can be used in so many ways. You can use it as a base for gravy. You can use it as a base for soup. You can turn that soup into more soup, like a turkey noodle soup. You can use it as a beverage to sip on during those really cold winter nights, or on an evening where you are not feeling well. You can use it to cook grains like rice. It's incredibly easy to make, and it really takes no time at all. Welcome back to A Better Choice Homestead, where on my channel I focus on food, growing it, preparing it, and preserving it for better health, self-reliance, and security. So rather than throw away those bones, which would be such a waste, get them simmering on your stove and add some amazing stock to your freezer or your pantry shelf. Now, if you're gonna add it to your pantry shelf, you're gonna need to pressure can it, and that will go a long way in adding some long-term food storage for you. But otherwise, you can simply pop it into your freezer and pull it out whenever you want to make something with it. So let's get to it. Now, there are different ways that you can make stock. You can make stock, the base of it is bones, and the bones preferably have some meat left on them as well. You can also add different vegetables, aromatics, things like peppercorns, bay leaf, carrots, celery, onions. I'm gonna keep mine very, very simple today, because if you are searching on YouTube for a way to make turkey stock or turkey broth, sometimes people use those words interchangeably, it might be the first time that you're making it. And so I just want to keep this really, really simple. So we are just going to use bones and a couple of seasonings. Now, these are the bones from the turkey that I made for Thanksgiving. I always break my turkey down after dinner, same night, and I just get it into small enough pieces that I can stick it inside of a Ziploc bag. So I've got a stock pot here, and I'm just going to add these bones to the stock pot. I've got bones of all sizes here. They definitely do have some meat on them, you know, like the thigh bone. I pulled off most of the meat, and I made my turkey chili with that. And the carcass, the body of the turkey carcass, I just, tore into 3 pieces. It breaks down fairly easily. So we're just gonna get this all into the pot. And this also has some skin in it. Skin has fat. Fat brings flavor. So if you are planning on putting this in the freezer or even in your refrigerator, if you're going to be making something with this in the next week or so, you can certainly leave the fat on. If you're going to be pressure canning this, I would still leave the fat on it, but you're going to need to refrigerate it overnight so that you can skim the fat off the top once it separates. Fat does bring a lot of flavor, so I put any leftover skin, which is usually from the back, because we kind of like the dark, roasted, flavorful skin that's on the breast. The skin that's in here is the stuff that nobody really wants to eat. All right, so with my pot fairly full with just meat and bones, we are going to add a few spices. And spices are chef's choice. I'm gonna add a couple of bay leaves, and that's going to impart a nice flavor in here. So just a couple of those. I'm gonna add a few peppercorns. I'm just gonna do it from my grinder. So maybe 15 peppercorns. And then a little bit of salt. Now, if you're planning on pressure canning this, you can also hold back on the salt. You can add a teaspoon of salt per quart or half a teaspoon of salt per pint. But I am going to add just a little bit here just to flavor it up. Now we need to take this to the sink, and we need to put enough water in here so it's just barely covering the bones. You can see that there's quite a bit of meat still left on these bones. So again, stock is bones and meat and vegetables if you want to add them. And broth is meat and vegetables if you want to add them. Just want to make sure everything is as seated in there as well as it can be, so that we can get as much water in here as possible, so that we yield a good amount. Now, I mentioned that there are different ways that you can do this. I'm doing it, like I said, the really easy, simple way, honestly, because I don't have a lot of time to get this done and these bones need to get cooked. So you could roast these in the oven at about 450 degrees for 30 or 40 minutes if you want that really roasted golden color stock as your end product. But this is going to be fine just the way it is. And again, this couldn't be easier. So I'm going to get this turned on. I'm going to put it at about a medium to start. And when it really starts to heat up and starts to form some bubbles, I'll turn it down to a simmer. And then we're going to let it simmer for about an hour. I haven't fully committed to my end product yet. I want to wait and see how much this produces. If I would get at least 3 quarts worth, I'll probably pressure can this. If not, I'll probably just freeze it, and likely I will stick some in the refrigerator and I will make a beautiful chicken noodle soup out of this for a quick weeknight meal this week. Either way, it's going to be delicious. And again, this just can't be easier. Don't throw your bones away. Whenever I make any chicken product that has bones in it, any pork product that has bones in it, or beef, whatever, I keep all of those bones so we can make a quick stock whenever we need to. And today, with grocery store prices just being out of control, inflation hitting everybody hard, having options like this to stretch your dollar and your meals really helps. So don't throw your bones away. All right, this has come up to a slight boil, which is perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and put the lid on. And I'm going to lower this to simmer. And I'll check that in about 45 minutes. It took 20 minutes to get to this point. This is something you can certainly do on a weeknight. All right, let's see what we look like at the 45-minute mark. This smells delicious. It smells like Thanksgiving Day all over again. But I am gonna let this go for a little while longer. I'm gonna see if I can get some of those bits better submerged, because there's a lot of meat on the top here. So even though this is a quick stock, I still want it to have as much flavor as possible. So I think we're going to give that 20 or 30 more minutes. We're about an hour in right now, total. So back to simmer. Got 90 minutes total cook time, but I did taste this and it is very flavorful. It is really good. So next step is just going to be to get the bones out. Well, first I'll turn the stove off, and then we'll get the bones out as much as we can like this. And then when I pour it into a container that I will put into the refrigerator, I will strain it through a finer sieve. It's okay if you leave some meat in here. In fact, when this cools off, I could go through and I could pick some of the meat off if I wanted to leave that in there. We'll see what that looks like once it's cooled and I can get my hands on it. But otherwise, this is just going to go into the refrigerator overnight, where I can either then package it up for freezer, or I can skim the fat off of it and run it through the pressure canner. I think that we've got a good amount in here, so we will probably end up pressure canning this first thing in the morning. Then if I decide to do a turkey for Christmas or another holiday, Easter, or for next Thanksgiving, I will have enough turkey stock to make sure that there is plenty of gravy. I usually make my gravy from the drippings as the turkey is cooking, but there's every once in a while where you want extra gravy. So this is going to give me that option. You can also just use it as a base for a different type of soup. You can cook some rice in it, other types of grains, or just sip on it because it is very flavorful. And this is not a bone broth per se, because I'm not adding any of the aromatics, I'm not adding any of the vegetables. I did not roast the bones, and this is not being cooked low and slow over a 48-hour period of time. If you do want to do that with your turkey bones, you absolutely can. And if I do have a playlist for canning, and I have done beef bone broth that way. It would be the same way with chicken or turkey. So if you want to try your hand at bone broth, feel free to check out that video. This is just a plain stock. All right, I've got most of the big stuff out. So I'm gonna let this cool at this point, and I will bring you back once we are ready to pour it into the container for overnight cooling. All right, that did not take too long. I kind of cheated. I took the stock pot and I put it on my side deck here in about a foot of snow. So we got that cooled down pretty quickly. I can see that there is some fat on the top of this pan, but I'm not gonna worry about that until it is refrigerated overnight. So this is the container I'm going to put this in and store it in the refrigerator until tomorrow. And I'm just gonna ladle it in there. This is a fine mesh sieve. It's going to catch anything with any dimension to it at all that I wouldn't want in my finished product. I think the pan is probably light enough now that I can pour it in. So we did catch quite a bit of stuff on the bottom of this strainer, but tomorrow when I take it out of the fridge and I defat it, I will run this through a cheesecloth strainer just to get out every little last bit that I'm not gonna want in a jar. But I do want to give this a quick taste. Wow, that has so much flavor. So I am just going to put a lid on this, and this is gonna go right into the refrigerator. Now, here is all of the remaining pieces. And I can see in here that there is actually quite a bit of turkey. I don't want that in my stock. So I might pick through this just a little bit and, pull out what meat there is. It's pretty dry at this point. It had been simmering for about an hour and a half after being roasted. So this is something that I would just give to my dogs as a little treat. They will thoroughly enjoy that, and making sure that they don't get any bones whatsoever. Cooked bones cause a lot of problems, from rips and tears and punctures to just outright blockages. So you never want to give your dogs cooked bones ever. There is quite a bit of meat on here, so I am just going to pull some of that out, and they are going to love that. And I will see you back here tomorrow to can some turkey stock. Good morning. Now we get to take the fat off the top of this broth, and then I'm going to strain it again. I just did the one strain on it last night, and there was a reason for that. I just did it through the fine mesh colander because there were a lot of big particles. I like to do a fine strain on any type of broth that I do, especially if I've used bones, because there's a lot of stuff that can get into the broth that you don't necessarily want to drink or consume. But when I run something through a cheesecloth, it really does get just about everything out, all the impurities out of the broth, but it also clogs up pretty quickly, especially if there's a lot of big stuff. So I do the larger strain on it before I refrigerate it, and then the next day I'll pour it through the cheesecloth. Let's go ahead and skim this, and then we'll get this strained. All right, so I've got another fine mesh scooper here, and that's what I'm going to use just to skim the top of this broth and pull out the fat that has settled. Wow, this is amazing broth. I'm almost tempted not to can this because there is so much gelatin in here. It's incredible. This is really thick, and I am actually quite surprised by that because I didn't put vinegar or anything in the stock pot when I was simmering this. And it was a short simmer. It was 90 minutes in all. And, you know, when I make my typical beef or chicken broth, bone broth, it's a lot longer of a process. But this is amazing. This is really, really thick, especially considering that it was such a short cycle. I can't really skim any more off of here. Maybe I can with a little spoon. It's in the corners, but there's not that much. I am so surprised. I probably shouldn't be. This was the turkey that I picked up from my local farmer. So it was well cared for, pasture raised, which means it got a really good diet, exposure to sunshine, fresh air. Wow, this is incredible. I am super thrilled with this. There isn't all that much fat in here. There's some, but there's not all that much. And when I go in here to get this, you can just see the clumps of gelatin in here. It's super thick. So again, I am surprised, pleasantly surprised by how much gelatin is in there, because that's really good for you. All right, I'm just gonna get my 8-quart stock pot filled with this broth. I don't know exactly how much this is gonna make. I've got my lids and my rings and my jars ready. I've washed 6 jars. I know we're not going to fill 6 jars, but I like to be prepared just in case always. So we'll just see how many this takes. And then I'm gonna cover that with a well-used and also well-washed cheesecloth. And we are going to collect any of those remaining bone bits that might be still lingering in this broth. And this might take a minute, especially since it's so thick, but it will drain down, leaving the kind of bigger clumps of fat behind. I could just pour this straight in, but I can only get so much in here at a time because it's going to drain slowly because of how thick this is. I just can't believe how thick that is. It's incredible. Such a pleasant surprise. I would be happy if we got 4 quarts out of this. Oh, you know, I probably should have readied a pint just in case we don't have enough for a quart. I'll do that. I'm not going to add any additional salt or seasonings in here. I like to do that when I use it, and that way I can use it for a wider range of things. So if I wanted to, you know, for example, give some to the dogs, one of my dogs has some GI problems sometimes, and she gets pretty anorexic, but you can usually tempt her with some broth or homemade chicken or something. So if I, want to be able to pull something from my shelf to help nurse her along when she's not feeling well, I don't want it to be loaded with sodium. The farther down I go in here, the thicker this is getting. I'm thrilled with this. And these were bones that, I could have just thrown away. And instead, I have an amazing gut healing, gelatin filled turkey stock that I can use to make gravy, that I can use to make soups, cook other things in. So when you're canning stock or broth, you need to do a hot pack on it. So your broth needs to be boiling when you put it in your jars. So that's going to be the next step. I'm going to be heating up this stock pot here until it comes to a boil. And while that's heating up, I'm going to get my canner ready, because when you do a hot pack canning process, everything needs to be hot. Your canner needs to be hot. The water in the canner needs to be hot. Your jars need to be hot. And the contents that you're putting into the jars needs to be hot. So this is a pressure canning recipe. It's a safe tested, it's from the National Center for Home Food Preservation website, just turkey stock. That requires that it's pressure canned. And my pressure canner only requires 3 quarts of water, which is only about 3 inches inside of the pot. And in order to get these jars hot, we need to use water. So what I'll do is I'll fill these with hot water in my warming canner that has the 3 inches of water in it, so that the 3 inches of water will keep those jars and the water in those jars nice and hot until we're ready to fill them, at which time I'll just dump the water that's in the jars out in the sink, one at a time, as we fill one jar at a time. So this is coming along. I think I'm going to have to start holding it out because we're about half full in here now. And sometimes this might get fully clogged and not really release any more juice, at which point I would likely dump it back in here, rinse it out, and then do that again. And I've shown how to do that on my beef bone broth canning recipe. The other thing that can help is using a spoon. And if you just run the spoon along the bottom, you're going to displace anything that has collected and is blocking the liquid from draining down. And there's not a lot of stuff that's been left in here. I've only seen a few little specks. I can see a couple right now as I'm doing this. So pretty clean broth to begin with. But if you've ever done a home canned broth where after it's all processed and on your shelf, when you go to use it and you empty it out, and at the very bottom of the jar, you get like all this grit that looks kind of like sand. That's just the impurities that are left behind in the broth when you do a bone broth or a stock with bones. It could also be spices too if you add, like pepper and stuff in. But if you're processing stuff from bones, there's going to be impurities, and I just like to get those out if at all possible. All right, this is just about empty, so I'm going to move it a little bit just to give it a fresh part of the cheesecloth to strain through, and I'm going to pour the rest of this in. And there is some grit down at the bottom. It smells so good. Oh, and that was another reason why I didn't want to put like onions and stuff in here, because if I do end up using it for the dogs, onions are toxic to dogs. Not that I'll likely be using this for the dogs. I think this is the most beautiful turkey stock I've ever done. And the aroma on here is absolutely incredible. There we go. That's about it right there. That didn't take too long. But there is some smudge at the bottom of this cheesecloth, and I'll give you a look at that just to show you what I mean. It did collect some of the larger fat pieces. And it's clearly visible, so let me show you that. So you can see all the stuff that has collected here on the bottom. I don't want any of that in my finished product. So I'm gonna rinse this, it'll go through the washing machine, and then it'll be ready for use again the next time. So I'm just gonna get this turned on high, and we're gonna bring it up to a boil, and then I'm gonna get my canner set. I'm gonna go ahead and put the lid on it. As the liquid heats up to boil, it starts to convert to steam, and the steam escapes. And that equals loss of volume. So I want to keep the lid on to try to maintain as much volume with this stock as possible. All right, I'm going to get this cleaned up just a little bit, and then we're going to prepare the canner. I have the Presto pressure canner, and it is a dial gauge. However, I have converted it to a weighted gauge by purchasing this little add-on that allows you to pressure can at 5, 10, or 15 pounds of pressure, or PSI, pressure per square inch. This is the weight that came with my canner, and it just goes on the steam vent here. But this is a 15-pound weight, and it does nothing but sit there during the canning process unless you get over 15 pounds of pressure, at which time it will rock back and forth making noise, and you know that you need to adjust the temperature on your canner. If I were to use it set up in this way with this 15-pound weight here, I would have to watch this dial the entire time and make sure that I was right on the money at 11 pounds of pressure for the entire canning process. And that is how I did that for years. And it was incredibly stressful, especially because on my gas stove, it's really hard to find that sweet spot where we're holding a steady temperature. So when I discovered that I could buy this little attachment gadget to convert this to a weighted gauge canner, it changed everything for me. I no longer had to literally sit here and watch my canner for hours. Now I can just keep an ear out, because what this will do, once it comes up to pressure, which is 10 pounds of pressure for my elevation, it will rock the whole time. You don't want it to rock fast. You just want a steady rock back and forth. And as long as I can hear that anywhere on my main floor, I know that we are good. What it's doing when it does that is, if the pressure gets too high, it's letting off steam to maintain that 10 pounds of pressure per square inch. If it stops rocking, it's dropped below 10, and that's bad too. That means you have to start your processing time all over again, because you have to process for the full recommended time at the correct pressure. So if you drop below, doesn't matter if you're using the dial gauge or the weighted gauge, if you drop below, you have to reset your time. If you go above, you don't have to restart your time, but you do want to adjust. And if you adjust down or up, you want to do it very slowly and very gradually, because rapid changes in temperature and pressure can cause siphoning and or crack your jars. Sometimes it takes practice, and you're going to have to get used to how your stove and your equipment work together for canning. So if you're new to pressure canning, it's not hard, it's not scary. The models that they make these days are totally safe. You know, there's, for example, back here, there's this little black button here. If this were to get to a dangerous level of pressure, this is going to pop off and let all that steam out. So it's not like this thing is going to explode and, you know, put the lid through your roof or anything. Perfectly safe. If you haven't taken out that canner and given it its test run, this is a really easy way to get started with pressure canning because the timing on this is so short. It's 20 minutes for pints and it's 25 minutes for quarts. And that time starts once we are under pressure. Now, I'm going to be doing a pint if I can't fill a whole quart, and I can run the pints for the same time that I run the quarts, no problem at all. So you can mix the pints and the quarts in a pressure canner as long as you're doing the time for the larger jar. So this is my lid, and this is the weighted gauge that I'll be using. I'm just going to set the original gauge aside, or weight aside. And then in my canner, mine came with 2 racks. One always goes on the bottom. You do not want to set your jars inside of a canner without some sort of a rack, because the jars coming in contact with the bottom of the pot and the heat, it could crack them. You're going to end up with tilted jars, cracked jars, a mess. So always have something on the bottom of your canner. If you don't have a rack, you can lay a towel down on the bottom, or you can drop some rings on the bottom, you know, in a pattern so that they're next to each other and, you know, just all around the bottom. And then you can set your jars on top of the rings. That works perfectly fine too. So if you're able to pick up a pressure canner, maybe at a thrift store or something, but it didn't come with a rack, fear not, you can compensate for that. The other reason that I was really excited to switch over to this is this dial gauge needs to be calibrated for accuracy once a year, and there is absolutely no place near me in the entire state that I have found that does testing on these. So I was having to buy a brand new one every single year, and I no longer have to do that. And it's very important to make sure if you're using the dial gauge that it is accurate, because again, this is tested for safety, for food consumption safety, so you don't get sick and or kill somebody by processing at the appropriate pressure for the stated times. And if your dial gauge is not calibrated properly, you have absolutely no idea if you are under the correct amount of pressure. Okay, so I've got my rack in the bottom, and I'm just going to put this on the stove, and then I'm going to fill my jars full with water. I'm going to add my 3 quarts of water to the bottom of this pan. We're going to get it turned on to a medium high to get it nice and hot. 1 quart, 2 quarts, and 3 quarts. And now I'm going to fill all the jars up with water all the way, and then put them in the canner, get the stove turned on, get everything heated up. This second rack I don't need. I only need this if I'm doing pints, because if I'm doing pints, I can double stack them in this canner by putting 1 row on the bottom and then stacking the second set of jars on the top. I can't do that with quarts in this canner. It's not tall enough, but I can do it with pints, but we don't need this. So I just set the equipment aside, but I always kind of keep everything together so that when I put this canner away, it's easy to just package everything back up. Nothing gets lost. And the other thing with this type of a canner versus the All-American, I do have one All-American, but it's the largest All-American. You can do something crazy like 20 quarts at a time, and it's too heavy for this range. It kills my digital display here in the front. I've had to replace that after using it. So now I have a propane setup outside where I could use it, but I don't really like to can outside. So when I move and design my own kitchen or upgrade my own kitchen, I'll make sure that I have a range that can handle it. So this ring needs to be in your canner when canning, and this needs to be soft and pliable, not cracked, not warped. So you just want to make sure that this looks good. It's in good working condition before you start canning. It's a good idea to wash this after each canning round. And that just fits under some little lip edges. And then the steam vent. So this is your safety pop-up thing. So if this came under too much pressure, this thing would just completely pop off and release the steam. This little steam vent here is where we are going to put that weighted gauge once we've let this vent for 10 minutes. So we want steam to escape from here for 10 minutes at a full stream, and then this is where we're going to put that weighted gauge. But if you're doing the dial gauge, that's what that looks like, and you would end up putting just that dead 15-pound weight here. I've got my jars filled with water. I'm gonna set those inside. So here's 4. Here's 6. I know I'm not gonna get this far, but just to be prepared, and a pint just in case. I'm gonna drop the lid on here. I'm not gonna twist it closed to build up steam or anything. This is just to keep the heat in, to keep those jars nice and warm. They were filled with hot tap water. Let's take a peek at this. This is just barely coming to a simmer, so we're good there. And this is our perfect time to set everything up for canning. So as soon as this pot and this pot are ready to go, we can get started. 7 rings or bands, because I have 7 jars in the canner, even though I know I'm not going to be filling that many. I wish, but even though I want to be ready just in case. And then we need lids. So I'm going to take out the same number of lids, 7. And they stick together when they're new. That's 5, 6, and 7. I really do like these 4 jars canning lids. I switched over to these in 2020 when Ball was having a really hard time keeping up with production. And I think I've only had one that didn't seal, and that could have been, you know, processor error. Like I didn't wipe the rim of the jar well enough or something along those lines. These are really nice, and I like the way that they are packaged. You get a lot. This was 100 lids. You don't have to buy them in quantities of 100, but when I buy canning lids, I'll typically buy 2 of the regular mouth and 2 of the wide mouth in the 100 quantity, and then I just don't have to worry about lids for a year or 2. I'm getting down, this is my last box of the regular mouth. I think I have 1 plus a few lids in my wide mouth. So I will be ordering more lids within the next year. You don't have to sterilize your jars, your lids, or your bands anymore as long as your processing time is at least 10 minutes, because things sterilize after being in something boiling hot for 10 minutes. This is going to be hotter than boiling hot. It's going to be under pressure, which is the only way to get it above boiling point. And it's going to be processing for 25 minutes, which is the requirement for quart size. So we don't have to sterilize anything. It's going to self-sterilize inside the canner. So that's one step you don't have to worry about. And if that's the way that you're used to doing it, you can still do it that way, absolutely. But it's a step you no longer have to do, or if you're new to canning, you don't have to do that step anymore. It sterilizes itself through the canning process. And next, I want to make sure that I have all of the other tools that I'm going to be using to get the food into the jar. So I have this canning kit. These are readily available. You can find them online. You can find them at your local ag stores. They're readily available. And I keep everything in this box. And this box fits in one of my kitchen drawers. And that way I never have to go looking for anything when I'm going to do canning. It's all right here. So in here, I'm going to pull out my funnel. I'm going to pull out my jar lifter. And I'm going to pull out my debubbler, headspace measure tool. The other two things that I have in here is a magnet that helps you pick lids up in case you were to sterilize this and put it in hot water. You wouldn't want to put your fingers in there, so this can pick it up for you and put it on top of the jar. I don't need that because I'm not sterilizing them. And then there's this jar lifter, which this one you hold like this, and you pick up the jar from the rim of the jar like this. This one, you can pick it up and hold it like this. I don't use this one. So, funnel, debubbler tool, jar lifter. A scooper to get the contents from the stock pot and get them into the jar. So, scooper. White distilled vinegar. I'm going to use this to wipe the rim of the jar after I get the contents into the jar. Especially this, because I know that there was a lot of fat in that broth, or stock I should say, and fat that has seeped onto the rim of the jar can interfere with your seal. So it can interfere with this orange band on the inside with making good contact and sealing to your jar. So you have to make sure that you wipe the rim of your jars really well with vinegar, and therefore I also have a towel here, a cloth napkin, that I will use to do that. And then when I'm ready to start and all the jars have been loaded into the canner, I'm just gonna pour this vinegar into the canner. It helps reduce the risk or the amount of that white film that you can get on the outside of your jars if you have hard water, which I do. So I did not measure this. It's maybe 3 tablespoons altogether of vinegar in here. So again, I'll use it to wipe the jars and then I'll pour it into the canner. All right, I added 1 towel here. This is so I can take this lid off, but also so it'll help me get these jars out of the canner. We are at a good boil here. I've turned it down to low just to keep it super hot while we fill the jars. I'm gonna go ahead and get this lid off. And this canner is also nice and hot. The jars in here have little bubbles of hot condensation on them, so they're ready to come out. So I'm gonna use the jar lifter. I'm gonna pull it out and then make sure that hot water doesn't drip on my hand or the floor by using the towel. And I'm just gonna dump this in the sink. Now, if you wanted to add salt to your broth, now would be the time to do so. A teaspoon for a quart-sized jar, that's pretty warm, and half a teaspoon for a pint. With broth or stock, you're going for 1 inch of headspace. So if you have one of these tools, it's angled and it has steps on it, and each step is 1/4 of an inch. So if you put the highest step, the deepest step on the rim of your jar, your liquid should just touch the bottom step. And once you do that for a while, you can pretty well eyeball it. This looks and smells so good. That should be good, but we'll verify. That's perfect. So I'm just going to dip my cloth napkin into my white distilled vinegar, and then I'm just going to wipe the rim. Grab a lid, place it in the center, take a band, and this is going to be a finger tight turn, which is not very well explained in anything that I could find. So what I typically tell people is you put your ring on, you turn it counterclockwise until it seats itself, which you heard it just did that, and then move it forward with just maybe your middle finger in a clockwise rotation. And once you can't turn it anymore, then you're going to take that napkin that you have right here to hold your jar because it's hot, and you're just going to use your fingers and give it a little twist, but no wrist. So fingers only until it stops, and you would have to use your wrist to put more tension on it. And then use your jar lifter because this jar is now really hot with the hot contents, and then just lower that right into your canner. And we repeat. Be careful if you're doing it this way that when you dump the water, you're not going to dump it onto your hand because it's pretty hot. We'll test that headspace. Right on the money. Which, if you're using a regular mouth jar and you have one of these, it's really until, as you're pouring the liquid in, it just comes up, just past the bottom of this funnel. And as I'm wiping the rims of these jars, I'm also making sure that I'm not feeling any nicks or cracks on there. They could also compromise the seal and waste the contents of the jar because it's not either going to seal properly or stay sealed. So I just did it counterclockwise till it's seated, move forward, and fingers only. 2 quarts. Headspace is good. And that's really hot. And you want to check your headspace before you wipe the rim of your jar, because if you have to take some out because you don't have enough headspace, or you need to add more because you have too much headspace, you're going to have to wipe the rim of your jar again. So we're going to counterclockwise till it seats, and then push it forward as much as you can without using any finger action, and then finger tight turn. We are getting down to where it's hard to scoop. I'm going to go ahead and turn the flame off and tip this pot a little bit. There's still plenty to fill this quart for sure. But there's definitely not enough to do another pint or quart, and I'm not going to do a little half pint. But I could, you could. So we got 4 quarts out of 1 turkey carcass. And I'm just going to take these water-filled jars and empty them into the sink and get them ready for use for another project. Now that I only have 4 quarts in here, I'm just going to spread them out evenly in the canner. Now, if you wanted to, you could, anytime you have empty space in your canner, you can always jar water and have some sterilized water on hand, which could be good in the case of an emergency. It could be good to help wash out wounds. I don't have enough jars available to store water that way, so I'm just going to go with the 4 quarts. So now I'm going to put my lid on, and I'm just going to line up the arrows that are on the handle and the lid, and that allows it to seat perfectly. If I didn't line them up, it wouldn't seat. So once they're lined up, it'll seat perfectly, and then you twist it so the handles are right on, stacked on top of each other, and we can go ahead and get that heat turned up a bit because we want to see steam coming out of here before we set a 10-minute timer. And once that 10-minute timer goes off, we can put our weighted gauge over the steam vent, and then we start our processing time, which again is 25 minutes. Let's see how much of this broth we still have in here. It's not much, but I will stick it in the refrigerator because I am sure that I can find some sort of use for it. Oh, I forgot to pour this in my canner, so let's do that. It's not under pressure, so there is no harm in taking that lid off real quick, considering I just put it on. If it was under pressure, you would not do that. You would just have to contend with some cloudy jars. Let's see how much we got. Almost half a pint. Very beautiful, clean stock. I will let this cool down before I put that in the refrigerator. Maybe I'll make a little gravy or something with that this week. Now, as soon as this comes to a full steam vent, I will show you what that looks like so we can start our 10-minute timer. So this is a full steam. Can you see? It is a very steady stream of steam. So we can go ahead and let that go for 10 minutes, and then we'll put our weighted gauge on. Our timer's gone off. That's our first 10-minute timer. You can see we still have steam coming out at a steady pace. I'm going to go ahead and carefully put my weighted gauge right over that steam vent. And now the pressure is going to start to build inside the canner. Once it does, and it reaches 10 pounds of pressure, this is going to start to rock, and I'll hear that. Once I hear that, I'll bring you back, and then we'll start our processing time, which is only 25 minutes. So I'll see you back here in a few minutes. We have reached pressure, and now our weight is rocking back and forth. You can also see on the dial that we are at 10 pounds of pressure, so this is perfect. Our timer is just about ready to go off, and I wanted to show you, there it is, what our jiggle looks like. And you can see that this is saying that it's at 11 pounds of pressure, and this is holding it at 10. So there's a little variation there, but in any case, we are done. All I'm going to do though is turn this heat down. I'm going to reduce the heat slowly because again, a rapid change in temperature or pressure can cause siphoning of the product out of the jar, and it can also cause problems with the jar itself. So let's just dial this heat back. And we'll let that cool down at this temperature for about 15 minutes before we turn this off. All right, so we're at about, what is that, maybe 7 pounds of pressure. And I'm gonna go ahead and turn this heat off. And this will probably take, I don't know, maybe another 20, 25 minutes to come fully down. We have come down completely to 0. And this little guy here is flush. So he's popped up when it's under pressure. Once that goes down, and only once that goes down, you can take off your weight regulator. And we're just gonna take that off and let that sit for 5 minutes. And now that those 5 minutes are done, we can finally crack our lid. So this is just a twist. And I'm just gonna seat it on the edge here and let that steam escape. and let it acclimate for another 5 minutes before I pull the lid off. Okay, now we can take the lid off now that that last 5-minute timer is done. And this is the moment where we cross our fingers and hope that every precaution that we took in the process of getting the jars into the canner and with the temperature on the canner that we don't siphon. And I can see that I did. There is cloudy water in here, so at least one of the jars siphoned, which means that some of the contents from inside the jar escaped during the canning process. Now, venting in here is normal. That's what headspace is for. The headspace is measured so that the jars can vent properly during the canning process to force the air out, but sometimes you end up siphoning. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not a welcome thing, but it doesn't hurt anything as long as two things are true. Number one, you haven't lost more than half of the liquid in your jar. If you did, then pop that into the refrigerator and get it used up in a few days. The other thing that can happen when you siphon is if the contents that came out of the jar have a lot of fat in there or food particles that can get stuck on the rim, you might not get a good seal. So I'll want to check these jars very, very carefully just to make sure that they properly sealed. So I'm going to go ahead and get these out, and then I will show you what the canner looks like with the water that has some siphoning liquid in it. When you take your jars out of the canner, you want to grab them just under the lid by the neck. And then I always place a towel under it because hot water is going to drip off of these and that can burn you. And then you're going to place them somewhere where they're not going to be disturbed for 12 to 24 hours. With a completely liquid content like this, 12 hours is sufficient. But if you move them too soon, and if any of the contents of the jar get up near the rim before it is fully adhered to the jar, which takes 12 to 24 hours, you could risk not getting a good seal on these. And then all that work would be for naught. So this is where they will stay until I am ready to wash the jars and get them onto the pantry shelf. And these don't look too bad. You can see that the contents still look like they're right at about the 1-inch mark, but that may change as they cool. They could, lower in volume. So I'll let you see what that looks like when they're completely cool. And here is what our canner looks like. It's not bad, but can you see just the little grease marks on the top floating there on the water? So that tells me that either the jar's siphoned or that I had maybe spilled some as I was putting them into the jar. They got on the side of the jar, and now that fat is kind of floating here on the top. It's not bad, but a little bit of siphoning. All right, here are my jars. It's been about 10 hours since I did these. It's now late at night and I'm getting ready to go to bed. You can see that they siphoned. Not a lot, so there's not a lot missing, but that line up where the stock is should be higher. So they each did siphon a little bit. That's okay. They're fine. Siphoning happens. So it's unfortunate, but it's not the end of the world. It does look like all of our lids have sealed, at least the button has popped down. But because these siphoned, I'm gonna wait until tomorrow before I take the rings off, and I will make sure that those lids are on there nice and tight. If they're not, it's too long of a gap between when these came out and when I will be able to check them, just to be certain that they're on there tight for the food to still be safe. So fingers crossed, but I will update in a comment if I had to toss any of these. I also have my canner ready to be put away. This is how I store it. I make sure that everything is inside so I never have to go looking for any of the pieces. I have both of my racks here and both of my weighted gauges here. So those sit inside. And then I store it with the lid upside down because it won't fit on my shelf like this, and this will protect that gauge on the top anyway. Thank you so much for joining me for another edition of Sunday Funday, a simple stock in the making turkey stock, and followed by a how-to can tutorial. My name is Kelly, you're at A Better Choice Homestead, and I do hope you come back and visit again soon.